Hey there. Today's title is My Fiancée Accused Me of Cheating, and her dad and brother physically attacked me. The truth is out and I found out the main culprit behind it. Let's begin. I'm 28, just an ordinary guy with a steady office job, a decent apartment, and a life I thought was simple and predictable. About a year ago, I met someone who completely changed that. Her name was Tessa, a 26-year-old who was everything I thought I wanted, intelligent, funny, and supportive in a way that made me feel invincible. After dating for over a year, I proposed to her in a quiet, personal moment. She said yes, and I felt like I'd achieved the dream. Not long after, we celebrated with a small engagement party at her parents' house, surrounded by family and close friends. At the time, it seemed perfect, but in hindsight, there were subtle signs I didn't pick up on. Her mother had a way of making remarks that felt loaded, commenting on my stability and how Tessa needed someone reliable. She mentioned how hard I must work without family connections, remarks that now seemed more judgmental than conversational. Her father, though polite, seemed to take a back seat, leaving her mother as the dominant voice. Her brothers, despite being younger, carried an almost overbearing protectiveness, acting as if I was some kind of intruder. I dismissed it all back then, assuming things would naturally settle down once we were married. That assumption turned out to be naive. Around 8 months into our engagement, Tessa's behavior began to shift. She became more cautious, asking probing questions about my day, questions that felt more like tests than genuine curiosity. I attributed it to the stress of planning a wedding and didn't think much of it. One Saturday, though, everything unraveled. She showed up at my apartment looking tense and holding her phone tightly in her hand. Without much of a preamble, she confronted me with blurry photos of me leaving a restaurant with a woman. The images were low quality and looked like something out of a bad surveillance tape. I recognized the woman in the photo as Maya, a coworker I'd had lunch with the previous week to discuss a work project. What seemed like an innocuous event had apparently become something far more sinister in Tessa's mind. Her demeanor was cold as she questioned why I hadn't mentioned the lunch. The suspicion in her tone was unmistakable, as though she had already decided I'd been hiding something. She accused me of sneaking around and insinuated that I was just like every other man who couldn't be trusted. I tried to explain, pointing out that it was nothing more than a work-related meal, even offering to show her the emails setting it up. But my words seemed to slide right past her. She wasn't interested in explanations or proof. To her, the photos were damning evidence, and anything I said was just an attempt to cover my tracks. It became clear that her mind was made up long before she walked through the door. Her disbelief in me was absolute, and it felt as though everything we'd built together, the trust, the love, had vanished in an instant. The Tessa I thought I knew, the one who once looked at me like I was her entire world, was gone. In her place was someone who saw me as a liar, someone she could no longer trust. That moment made me question everything about our relationship. How could she assume the worst so easily? How could she not see who I really was? It was as though she'd been waiting for an excuse to find a flaw, and now she had one, no matter how flimsy it might have been. That was the moment it all started making sense. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a case of misplaced anger. Tessa wasn't upset, she truly believed I was the worst kind of person. It felt like she wanted to believe it, like she had been waiting for a reason to tear me down. I tried to approach her gently, questioning what might really be behind this sudden hostility. Her closed-off expression gave me nothing, so I made a guess. I wondered aloud if her mother had been influencing her, feeding her lies. The tension in Tessa's jaw and her refusal to respond said everything I needed to know. The confirmation was like a gut punch. Was this all it took? A couple of low-quality photos and her mother's disapproval for Tessa to turn against me completely? Before I could process it, a loud, aggressive banging echoed through my apartment. It wasn't a knock, it was someone trying to break the door down. Moments later, the door burst open, and there stood Tessa's father and her 2 brothers, their expressions filled with rage. Their intentions were clear: this wasn't a discussion, it was a confrontation. Tessa's father was the first to speak, shouting accusations that I had played with his daughter's heart and disrespected her. The venom in his words was undeniable. Her brothers flanked him, radiating hostility, and one of them began cracking his knuckles as if preparing for a fight. I tried to explain, to defend myself against the baseless accusations. I insisted I hadn't cheated and that the photos weren't what they thought. But they weren't interested in the truth. They had already decided I was guilty. One of the brothers stepped forward, challenging me and twisting my words into more ammunition against me. The shouting escalated, and before I knew it, the father's fist connected with my jaw. The first punch knocked me back, and then the second brother grabbed me, shoving me into the wall. The impact sent a lamp crashing to the ground, and a sharp pain shot through my shoulder. I caught sight of Tessa out of the corner of my eye. She stood there, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold without any emotion, no shock, no effort to stop them, just cold detachment. They kept coming, fists flying and accusations blending with their shouts. It was as though they had been waiting for an opportunity like this, something to justify their pent-up aggression. No matter how much I denied the accusations or tried to plead for a moment to explain, they didn't care. They weren't there for answers, they were there to punish me for something I hadn't done. At some point, I ended up on the floor, shielding my head as they kicked me. Pain radiated from my ribs, and my vision blurred from the impact. The physical pain was agonizing, but it didn't compare to the betrayal I felt watching Tessa do nothing. She stood there, letting it happen, as if I meant nothing to her. Finally, her father called it off, pulling the others away and leaving me bruised and broken on the floor. He issued a warning, threatening worse consequences if he ever saw me near Tessa again. As they left, Tessa's parting words were as cutting as their blows: the engagement was over, and I should consider myself lucky they hadn't broken my bones. The room was in shambles: overturned furniture, a broken lamp, blood staining the carpet. I lay there for a while, dazed and struggling to breathe. Eventually, I managed to crawl to my phone and call a friend to take me to the hospital. The doctor confirmed bruised ribs, a split lip, and a mild concussion. When I explained what had happened, he urged me to report it, warning that people like this wouldn't stop unless held accountable. I left the hospital seething with anger. Every fiber of me wanted revenge, to confront them and make them feel the pain they'd inflicted on me. But I knew I couldn't let my emotions take control. Instead, I channeled my fury into resolve. This time, they wouldn't get away with it. The next day, I called a lawyer friend and recounted everything. This wasn't just about the attack, it was about reclaiming my dignity and standing up for myself. The officers listened attentively as I explained the situation, nodding occasionally and offering assurances that they would investigate. Still, they warned me that cases like this could take time. Their sympathy should have been comforting, but it wasn't. All I felt was a hollow emptiness. The woman I had planned to spend my life with had believed a blatant lie and allowed her family to assault me because of it. Despite the hurt and betrayal, one thing was certain: I wasn't going to back down. If they thought they could silence me with fear, they were sorely mistaken. This was only the beginning. A week later, an unexpected call came through. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. On the other end was Tessa's uncle, someone I barely knew. We'd crossed paths maybe twice at family events, and he'd always seemed like the quiet, no-drama type. When he insisted that we needed to talk, I reluctantly agreed. We met at a remote diner off the highway. He was already seated when I arrived, looking around nervously as though he were being watched. Then, he leaned in and whispered that I deserved to know the truth. His words hinted at something significant, so I simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. What he revealed was staggering: the entire ordeal had been orchestrated. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an impulsive reaction. It was a calculated setup. Tessa's mother, who had never liked me, had been trying for months to end our relationship. She wanted Tessa to marry a wealthy family friend with better connections. The pieces started falling into place as he explained further. Tessa's mom had hired someone to follow me, take compromising photos, and fabricate evidence of infidelity. On top of that, she had spread rumors about me, painting a picture of deceit and betrayal. When I asked how Tessa could have believed such nonsense without question, he admitted that her mother was incredibly persuasive, and Tessa had always been easily influenced. Anger coursed through me as I processed the extent of the deception. Not only had they destroyed my relationship, but they had also tarnished my reputation, wrecked my home, and left me physically battered, but I had to stay calm to ask the right questions. I asked Tessa's uncle how he was aware the mother planned it, and then he replied that he introduced the private investigator to Tessa's mom some years back and he still reports back to him. Apparently, Tessa's mom wasn't aware. I went further to ask why he was helping me, and he just said he genuinely liked me from the first day Tessa introduced me to him, and also he didn't want me to end up like the last guy. He didn't want to disclose the information surrounding that, so I let it go. I asked him if he had any proof, and to my surprise, he slid a USB drive across the table. It contained texts, emails, and other evidence of the conspiracy. Later, back at my apartment, I plugged the drive into my laptop and began reviewing the files. Everything was laid out in black and white: messages about hiring a photographer, coaching Tessa on how to confront me, and openly declaring that I wasn't good enough for her. The blatant manipulation was sickening. I forwarded the evidence to my lawyer immediately, who was astounded by the revelations. This wasn't just about the assault anymore. The situation had escalated into a case of premeditated conspiracy. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of control. The next morning, I turned the evidence over to the police. The detective reviewing the materials was visibly taken aback. He acknowledged the damning nature of the evidence and assured me they would follow up. Meanwhile, word of the charges quickly spread to Tessa's family. Suddenly, their tune changed. Her father left a voicemail urging me to resolve things amicably, while one of her brothers sent a half-hearted apology, claiming they had overreacted. Even Tessa reached out, sending a rambling text from a different number. She claimed she had been manipulated and didn't know who to believe. Her message was filled with regret and pleas to talk, insisting she missed me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Where was this confusion and remorse when her family was tearing apart my home and attacking me? She had had plenty of chances to ask for my side of the story but chose not to. Now that the truth was out, she wanted to rewrite history. My lawyer was excited about the new developments, declaring that our case was now irrefutable. Between the physical evidence, the messages, and the injuries, we had a solid case for assault and conspiracy. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like justice was within reach. The news that the culprits were in serious trouble was satisfying, but this wasn't going to be an overnight victory. Legal proceedings take time, and the investigation was still unfolding. However, knowing that the law was finally on my side made enduring the constant harassment from Emma's family somewhat easier. A few days later, the first major breakthrough occurred. My lawyer called with an update: the police had issued warrants for her dad, her brothers, and her mom. They were charged with assault and conspiracy, and the authorities wasted no time making arrests. When the police arrived to take her dad and brothers into custody, the two of them tried to argue their way out of it, claiming they had been defending their family. The officers, already armed with evidence, dismissed these excuses. This wasn't self-defense, it was premeditated assault. The most satisfying part was hearing how blindsided her mom had been. She had acted untouchable throughout this ordeal, but when the police showed up at her door, reality hit her hard. She tried to play the victim, insisting that she had been protecting her daughter and never intended things to escalate. The evidence told a different story: this was a deliberate attempt to ruin me. Meanwhile, Tessa's desperation became more apparent. She left a voicemail in which her voice sounded like she'd been crying for hours. She claimed ignorance of her family's plans and begged for a chance to explain. It was too little, too late. Perhaps she didn't know the full extent of her mother's schemes, but she had still chosen to believe fabricated photos over me. She hadn't even given me an opportunity to defend myself before letting her family destroy everything we had. Trust had been completely broken. I deleted the voicemail and blocked her number. Tessa's family, realizing how serious their position was, shifted strategies and resorted to bribery. A distant cousin of hers approached me in my office parking lot, claiming they felt remorse and wanted to avoid court. They offered to cover my medical bills and even suggested a settlement if I dropped the charges. It was insulting. They thought they could put a price on what they'd done, as though throwing money at me would erase the pain and humiliation. I turned them down immediately. They could explain their actions to a judge. Not long after, Tessa reached out again through a mutual acquaintance, asking to meet and clear the air. My lawyer advised that I could meet her as long as I wasn't alone, so I agreed, more to finalize things than to hear her out. When we met, she was a wreck. She tried to justify her actions, blaming fear, confusion, and family pressure for her choices. She said she regretted everything and wished she had handled things differently. The trial approached quickly. With my lawyer's help, I was fully prepared to face the courtroom. I testified about the attack in vivid detail, how they forced their way into my home, ignored my attempts to explain, and beat me until I was left battered and bleeding. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including incriminating text messages, photographs of my injuries, and a USB drive containing proof of the conspiracy. The defense's arguments were feeble. Her dad and brothers claimed they had been defending their family's honor, but the jury wasn't convinced. Her mother's attempt to downplay her role fell flat when confronted with the digital trail of her involvement. The verdict was clear: guilty. When the sentencing was announced, I felt relief. Her dad and brothers received prison sentences for aggravated assault, while her mom was convicted of conspiracy. They would all carry criminal records for the rest of their lives. Tessa avoided legal consequences but suffered socially. Her reputation was in shambles, and she became known as the person who believed lies and allowed her family to almost ruin someone's life. Even after the sentencing, she attempted to contact me again, but I ignored her messages. That chapter of my life was closed. I had fought for justice and won, but more importantly, I had fought for myself. Moving forward, I focused on rebuilding and ensuring that no one could ever take advantage of me again. This experience was a harsh reminder of the importance of self-respect and standing up for what's right. For anyone facing toxic situations or people, my advice is simple: know your worth, stand your ground, and never let anyone diminish your power.